So for those who know me, they know that I've been quite strict on time. And I was talking to Prof. Budowle over lunch. And one of the things he said, oh, well, what do you want me to talk about? Do you still want me to talk about my presentation? I said, well, I'm sure you can talk about anything you want because you know so many things. But he said he's going to stick to that. But what I agreed to is that he said, can I have more time? So I said, okay, if I give you an extra 5 minutes, then I can't give you a long introduction. He said, that's fine, because I think most people know who he is. Am I right? Yeah. So I'm going to hand it over because he needs the extra minutes, and I'm sure you all want him to present as long as possible, because he really is one of the forefathers of forensic science, the architect of DNA CODIS in the CODIS system in the United States. He's published more forensic science journal articles, I think, than any forensic scientist in the world. And one of the things I always say about you, Bruce, is that you care, you're a humanitarian, you're a problem solver. It's an honor to have you amongst us today. Thank you for being here, and thank you for your presentation, which is going to highlight the issue of human trafficking. This is something we haven't touched on today, but it's certainly something as an East African community. We have to understand that the borders are very porous. We have a massive, massive problem with human trafficking, which isn't really spoken about. And unfortunately, Nairobi is one of the conduits where a lot of the people who are trafficked are leave. So without, you see, he's kicking me off the stage here.
Remember, she said this was going to be a short introduction.
This is the short version. So I'm going to leave the mic to Bruce and enjoy, and thank you very much, Bruce, for being here as always.
Thank you, Vanessa. I wish one thing Vanessa wouldn't do is say I'm the father of like DNA, because my wife is going to get mad at me if I'm the father of something other than my children, our children, and that. So we can do that. So anyway, well, thank you. And yes, we haven't talked about human trafficking, but Ahmed, are you here still somewhere? Okay. So Ahmed brought up, migration. We as humans have been migrating since the beginning of humankind, because we all started in Africa and we went around the world, and it's an important thing. But along the way, we do experience not always good conditions. So some go by design, and others are forced into it by exploitation or being exploited or abused in the process. So there's another component we have to think about when we're talking about the movement of people, and sometimes even when they're staying within country, the exploitation as well. And Stephen mentioned it, so I'm going to talk about DNA and its impact, of course, but Stephen mentioned it in his about, we have to think of DNA as only a small part of the puzzle or of the picture, and that there's a lot of other aspects that we need to consider to be able to make it work. And that, so we're going to try to look at a more holistic approach, and much of what Ashley and Wangu and Kizzy talked about applies as well to human trafficking. So there are many things we have to think about where DNA can be part of it, but it has to deal with all these different topics of how are we going to impact that? How are we going to deal with the victims? We heard victim-centric. It's critical we start thinking about it, and we often focus on just the component where we meet the victim, but all the supporting around that, even the collecting of evidence, we have to think victim-centric. We have many data silos. We talk about DNA, but what is the other DNA, the other data that are going to help us do a better job? And so on. We talk about forensics, education and training. The trafficking can be in your neighborhood and you're not aware of it because you're not looking for it. The healthcare system doesn't address it because it's not aware of it, it's not trained to deal with it, and they can help. And then of course the criminal side of it as well. So I'm going to try to talk a little bit about what is human trafficking, just to give a brief insight into that. We're going to talk about databases, other types of databases, and then strategic planning that we all need to do as we talk during breaks and that as well. So, human trafficking is forced exploitation. It could be for labor, it could be for sex, it could be for pandering, it could be for all sorts of things. And people are being exploited, but it's by force, and they are being abused in the process. We often talk about trafficking and smuggling in two different ways. Trafficking is this against your will, your coercion, and smuggling is your choice to do this. It's voluntary. I don't like making these distinctions because people are going from one bad situation with the hope to getting to a better situation. And most of the people, whether it's trafficked or smuggled, are going to bad situations. So they don't always get to a better place, and most of them do not. So the consequences are the same. So we should think about them and stop trying to segregate it as people are being exploited in either situation. I won't talk too much about it because, Ahmed brought it up, but migrations are happening not just because people want to go somewhere for opportunity, mostly because there are terrible situations where they live. We're seeing wars, poverty, drugs, crime, sexual assaults, and that all these things force people to leave their homelands. Most people don't want to leave their homelands. You grew up there, you like where you live, but you leave because conditions are not well for you to live there. You're looking for a better opportunity. And our world has a lot of problems these days. I mentioned already that, so let's skip on. Over 40 million people are trafficked per year. Now, some are from year to year to year, and then that's quite a lot of them. About 1/5 of them are sexual exploitation, and a good portion of them are forced labor and forced marriage and other things of that nature. And that I came from the state of Texas. The study was done. This is America. 300,000 people are under trafficking at this moment in time in Texas. So this isn't the problem of Africa. This is a problem of all of us. We all have to work together to solve that. And this is why. Which one of you would want to have this be your family and you're looking across the table and you don't see your loved one because they were exploited or kidnapped or sold off, as may be, or dead because they got used up in their trafficking and exploitation? The costs are high. To the individuals, you take a woman who's now in the sex trade because of being trafficked, they're going to use her over and over and over again. If you sell a gun, it's one time you sold it to somebody. You use a drug, it's sold one time. That woman is being used multiple times a day. So from a business perspective, this is the product that you can use over and over again. They make a lot of money on this. This is one of the most high industries of transnational crime comparable to drugs and weapons and that. So this is a problem here. And the average life expectancy for a trafficked individual, that is around 7 years. So people are not going to do well and they don't get back into society. And if they do, their health conditions are bad. That's another burden on society. And so we have a multiplying problem we have to think about. So we're going to talk about DNA and human trafficking, but it's really missing persons. So it's the same kind of things we talked about beforehand in the process. And it's typically, when we're thinking of this, to identify people, is humanitarian. So it's not really criminal. So we have mostly been talking about sexual assault on the criminal side. Here we're going to talk more about identifying people who have been separated by one means or another to try to bring them back to their families. So it's humanitarian. So some of the policies and rules will be different, but the databases are similar in nature. The searching is different, and some of the statistics and approaches are done will be different per se. So we have the two databases. You have the DNA side, and then we have the other data. And we're going to talk later about the other data that we need to bring together if we really want to tackle this problem. So I'm not going to talk a lot about the current approaches because we just spent the whole yesterday on current approaches, and now you're the experts, so you can talk about it later. But the standard markers used in human identification, the STRs, the YSTRs, the mitochondrial DNA, are the workhorses for human identification, missing persons and work. And any lab that's doing missing persons work really needs to have all those in place, and that to be able to be the most effective as they could be. There are technologies. The current standard one is the workhorse that all of you or most of you are using and around the world. And that has great value because it gives you experience in leveraging resources from all of us. And then there's rapid DNA if you need to go out into the field or subsidize what you're doing. And then there's next generation sequencing that could also reach out further or deal with very highly degraded samples, as we talked about. CODIS is a database. I was helped develop CODIS at the beginning, and that it's a great tool. The FBI will give it through requests to an appropriate agency. The FBI does not have any contact with you when you have the database. The database belongs to you. It's a standalone from them, and you operate the way you want. The value of it is it's free, and it's going to be upgraded on a continuous basis. So it's more sustainable than other kinds of databases. So that's real value, and it works in that because we have great success with it. The goal is where any database you use, and I'm using an example of human remains here, is we're going to put a profile in, we're going to put other profiles in, we're going to search, and we want a rapid response. We don't want to take weeks or months or years to develop the lead if we can get it here in a very short time frame. That's the real value of it. Saves you time, and it saves you resources that could be used for other purposes in the process. When you think of a database for humanitarian purposes, and I've just laid some of the things here, you're going to have a database of reference samples, which could be relatives of the missing person. It might be the mother, the father, the son, the brother, who donate their DNA. So you can put it in the database to search against the human remains. Most of the work we think about is unidentified human remains, and that's one kind of person we may find, but there are other vulnerable groups, and there should be discussion on what we should consider with those vulnerable groups. For instance, we have, when Haiti had that massive earthquake about a decade ago, a lot of the children became orphans. They were living on the street. Some of those were taken and being shipped to Brazil, through Bolivia, through Brazil. And they were being exploited, they were being sold off. This is a vulnerable group. Should we start thinking about our vulnerable groups and put them into databases to protect them in case they are taken somewhere? So another thing to think about in the process. The next question you have to think about is the government versus the private databases. So the government has a responsibility to do this, and they're going to have access to CODIS if you ask for it, or another database. Private enterprises also can generate databases using a different type of tool or that, and they're going to collect samples and they're going to do things with it. And sometimes it's an NGO that does it and such. And now you have this kind of fragmented system, and it can create problems if it's not coordinated. So, but there can be advantages to one system or the other, or a hybrid of those. And we have to think about those to think where we want to be. Government labs, the advantages, pretty much you're all using the same technology, same markers, because you have to communicate. So we have this very well-developed system. Government labs think about safety and security, think about privacy, really important issues when we come to collecting information on people, whether it's DNA or metadata as may be. And it allows to be more sustainable because the government's going to invest at some level for the work to be done. And I'll skip that one. And then private databases may use the same technology, or they may use alternate technologies for reasons being either they want to get into a sort of like a marketplace that's unique to justify why they're valuable to the process, and there could be good reasons for that. And there are advantages to having these more innovative, less constrained kind of systems, is they can get leads in very difficult cases that the government may not consider working on. They can be dynamic because they don't go through the same kinds of machinations to get validated and get things online and that. And sometimes they can be very forward thinking, looking at new marker systems that may take longer in the government system. The limitations are often they lack validation studies. And we have validation studies are a cornerstone to having reliable data. And if you don't have the validation data, you can't demonstrate that what you're doing is actually correct and reliable. They often don't think about the safety, security, and privacy the same way because it's expensive. And private entities don't want to spend the money on those kind of requirements to protect the individuals in the process. And they may not be sustainable. The government is here, they're going to do this. The NGOs will do the things they do. If the money runs out, it's gone. So we have to think about the plus and minus in that in the process. So as we move forward, whether we take one system, the other, or combination, we have to keep our goals in mind. Our goals are to develop leads, to identify that individual, to bring them back to their family. Obviously, for human trafficking, we want to identify the perpetrators so that we can have some interdiction to stop those individuals if possible. But we have to maintain security, privacy, and intrusion on the victims' families, society in the process. We have to think about when to use one technology over another based on the amount of DNA we have, the question to be answered, as opposed to just doing the same thing every time. And that's so triaging becomes important. And most importantly, you have to recognize you have many constituents. So we mentioned victims and families. Not just victims and families, they're the most important ones, but it's our communities, it's the police, it's the government, it's the healthcare workers. They're all part of our constituents that we have to think about when we put a program together. Yeah. You have the problem of things happening in one country, but then trying to identify the remains in your country where they may have come from. So you're in Kenya, may have come from Uganda. These are challenges. We had the same problem in the US. My lab has the responsibility to type all human remains found in Texas. So, and this Texas is a gateway from Central America into North America. And that, so Mexico, Guatemala, Honduras, and so forth, gateway through to us. And as Ahmed said, people die when they go along the way. We have to identify them. A difficulty and a challenge is the remains are found on our side of the border, but the families are on the other side of the border. And based on the policies that the FBI set, which are good policies, we can only take reference DNA profiles from accredited labs. And if they're not accredited, we can't enter it into CODIS to do the searches we need. So we have to be innovative. What are we going to do? We have all these remains. We can't identify the individuals. So we worked with the FBI with special MOU to be able to get CODIS for a standalone database. And that for one purpose only, and that's for identifying missing persons on the other side, where we could set the standard for the reference sample. And that, so the Humanitarian DNA Identification Database was able to be done, and this is something you want to look at, the laws you have in place. There was a code of federal regulations in the US that said the FBI could provide assistance to humanitarian efforts, different than our DNA Identification Act, and for humanitarian efforts, gave them the latitude to work with us, and they kindly and openly provided the tools to us to do that for the purpose to identify these remains. And then we would take on the responsibility to assess the data that came from a non-accredited lab in the process. And so we established all the profiles, how we collect them. We're typing the human remains, so we're held into the standard that we would do as accredited lab, but the profiles don't have to hold that same standard in that. And then, of course, you have to develop submission policies, searching policies, disclosure, reporting, some of the things we talked about yesterday in the workshop, and also data removal. And those are all built in and described in the process. So sometimes you have a situation where the rules are set for something, but there are probably places and ways to get around that without cheating to get and solve the humanitarian issues. So I find more governments and organizations are willing to work for humanitarian efforts because of the nature of what it is, where with a criminal, they may hold up and should hold a higher standard than that. One of the things we have to think about as we move forward is who's going to collect the samples? So now, you know, in a criminal thing, the police or the lab are going to collect the samples. When we're dealing with human trafficking, this is a wide range of individuals over wide spaces and stuff and all. So is the government the one that's going to do it? Or the NGOs going to do it? Well, the government has policies, it has legislation, has ways designed, hopefully, for protecting those individuals and their privacy. But some people don't trust the government. And so we have trust issues. So some people will step forward and others will not. So we're not getting all the individuals we need to get. NGOs, maybe a partnership can occur, but they may have better access to some of the families, so they get some of those samples. But there's also trust issues with the NGOs, because sometimes they have a conflict of interest of what their motivation is to exist. Some of them are out there to be humanitarian, and others are out there to get funding to continue their existence in that. So we have to find out who are the really good ones and who are the ones that are not, and ensure that once they have the data, eventually the government who's going to take over and have the massive responsibility can have access to the data of their citizens, but NGOs may or may not be willing to share that. So it gets complex in that. And I think, you have to all work together, whatever's the best solution. And there may be value in both of them, where an NGO could be sort of a front face for the process to help the government get the samples. And, one possible partner, I don't even know if Stephen's here. I'm not plugging Stephen because he's sponsoring in that, but we, worked in the past with the ICRC, and they're a well-respected group that doesn't get into the political or conflict on that. So they may be one solution to work with you on the process. One of the problems is when you have lots of different individuals or agencies collecting samples is they don't think of the consequence of when they collect the sample. We're thinking of humanitarians, so we're collecting samples of humanitarian, but there are a lot of other things that happen when you're dealing with trafficking, and there could be a criminal case involved. There could be victims that we need to identify so that we can provide the services that we heard about in the sexual assault discussions earlier. Same things for these victims as well. We have to identify the perpetrators, which will keep on doing what they're doing if people aren't aware of the process. And then there's adoption issues, there's organ trafficking, there's the postmortem identification, there's all sorts of other things that can happen. And these groups that are not prepared to handle the wide array of issues that arise are not helping society meet the goals that they should. So we really, again, I'm advocating more of the government role so that the government can do all these different aspects because it has the institutions in place to do so. So we have this big problem. We need a database. We got governments are now investing in this. To make it work, now we have to step away from the DNA part and think of our social responsibilities. And we touched on all of this already. One is, well, who are the vulnerable populations that we should think about trying to maybe proactively protect? We have to think about the cross-country things there, like that. How do we share data that's sensitive? So I have a database in Kenya, and I want to share my data with Uganda. There's privacy issues. How am I going to do that? We have to do it. We have to find the method of that. And we have to do it in a secure manner. And we have to disclose information in the judicial system. And we have cultural sensitivities. There's always cultural sensitivities in different ways. Countries look at it, peoples look at it, organizations look at it, that we have to think about when we're collecting the information on. I got 5 minutes. Do you want me to stop in 5 minutes? Or can I talk longer? Okay. We mentioned informed consent. I'm not going to go into it because it's been mentioned. Extremely critical. And I looked at most of the informed consent documents. They don't inform people. They ask for permission to use, but they don't inform people of what it is they're doing and what it's for. They don't tell you what the benefits are, and they don't tell you what the risks are in the process. So, and informed consents that may have been generated 10 years ago for collecting samples from family reference may not apply today because the technologies have changed. So we may have to think about that. And I want to just quickly mention victim-centered approach, sex workers versus the term sex trafficking victims or survivors. The words we use are powerful, and we've got to stop thinking of sex workers or prostitutes as the name of individuals have been then, and of course, attention to the victims, which has been addressed to some degree, so I won't do it because I have less than 5 minutes now. I'm not going to go into the understanding the mindset of the victim, but it's all, again, centric approach. And we heard like from Ashley and, the police officer she met. Texas is a really leading state in the United States on thinking about victim-centric. We actually have statutes, bills with the term victim-centric as driving how we do things. That might not have happened if she was in another state. And that, so this is a really important part of the process. Another important part is we have to take our time and resources that we're interested in this to train and enhance capabilities. I'm not here just to see Kenya because I'm really sitting in a hotel for 3 days. It's here for us to exchange so that we can all gain. So I can learn from you and you can learn from me, so we can figure out better ways to tackle this problem. We have to train each other. I'm going to skip that for now. Last, I want to talk about the concept of center of excellence, because you're all doing these things in a silo. You're doing it in your lab, you're doing it in your lab, you're doing it in your lab. That's not necessarily the best way to do it, because we're all resource strapped and we're also learning. And sometimes what happens in Joseph's lab says, oh my God, we have this problem, and he fixes it. You don't know about it and you don't gain from that experience. So you don't have to go through the same issue that he went through and vice versa. So that could be a real value in the process. So sometimes investing in a center of excellence that you could bring multiple experts together in one place to tackle the problems, because it's an immense problem. And it can be from, first of all, developing some standards for tackling this problem would be important, to standard protocols for using DNA. We have a lot of discussion. Is this one better than that one? Well, why don't we vet them so you all get what you think are the top tier ones and not struggle through trying different kinds of ways to do things. We have to think about how to develop local data and then share it on a grander scale and maintain that platform, and then have other information that we integrate into the process. So this is sort of the example of building an information system that's intelligence-based. DNA is only one part of it. There's a whole host of other things that we could tie together. And with the tools and capabilities we have today, we can find nexus points that we're not aware of if we put that data together in a place where we can now start searching and figuring out all the different things that may be in the process. So with that, I'm going to stress the last point again, working together. We work together, we're going to be able to solve more cases, we're going to identify more missing. That's it, has to be done. And by working together, we get this multiplier effect. We gain so much, and we may not need the resources that you think you need, because you have the one most important resource of all, and that's all of you. That's the most valuable one. That's the one that's going to make everything happen. And the more you work together, you'll be more sustainable. You'll get more support. You have more support. The law enforcement is going to look at it and say, I want more help. And they're going to get more resources through the process. And in the long run, you're going to solve cases, you're going to identify people, and maybe repatriate some of the ones who are living who got displaced as well. And with that, I'm going to thank everybody. And I stayed almost within my time.
Ah.
Thank you.
Thank you, Bruce. You know that we could all listen to you all day, and we always love what you say, and certainly hope that you'll be able to make available. I've got my own little box here. Thank you. We've got 1 minute literally for anyone have a question for Prof. Budowle.
My best friend.
A very short one. Thank you. Stand behind this. Yeah.
Thank you, Bruce, for your presentation. This is just a general question. As an aspiring forensic
Can you
science,
speak louder, please?
yes, I can.
You're being soft-spoken today.
Bit shy. Wanted to ask, as an aspiring forensic investigator and aspiring forensic investigator, what advice would you give us professionals who are going through that path to do proficient work and give excellent service? And then my second question would be, what is the greatest challenge you've faced in your line of work? May it be unresolved cases or just during your line of work? What is the greatest challenge and how did you tackle that challenge? And is there any way in this team, there's a case maybe we can handle or resolve or bring our minds together?
Okay.
So let's start with the first one. You want to be inspiring, be passionate about your work. Stephen mentioned the same thing. Be committed to what you want to do, because you have a really important role in society, and society is going to look to you with higher expectation of maintaining integrity, honesty, and the truth, and being accountable. So these are really important things. respect people, share with them. You have these qualities, the rest will come easy. Yeah, so it's really about how you are as a person and persons. And most people go into this field, you're not going to become a millionaire or okay, we're in Chile, a zillionaire to give you some money and that, but you're doing this because you have this commitment to something important in life, but it comes with a great responsibility. When you see these things in the media where the police did something that was not good, there's a big outcry because the public expects the police to do a good thing. And when they don't, there's a real concern. It's the same for you. So we don't want to have, the person who mocks up the, assaults the evidence or anything like that. We want to make sure you're doing the real principles of good individual that's going to contribute. And I think you have that. What was the second question?
Well, the second question you're going to have to answer personally, because I've got one question that is also very relevant and we've got
Okay.
limited time. Sorry, we're going to promise you we're going to get back to that one. Would rapid DNA help African countries with low DNA capability? Can you answer that?
Oh, yes. Okay. Reference DNA and low capabilities.
Rapid DNA.
Rapid DNA. Yeah, I think, if you don't have a capability, it's expensive to build a lab. Now, I'm a strong proponent to build a lab, get, the processing, because you have millions of samples to type, you need a high system in that. But if you don't have a capability and you need to get one, you can think of rapid as a way to move it there without having to build a big lab. So that's one solution to the process. And I don't think it's all or none. I just think it's a start of a process to build that, because if you get some success, they want more. Once you solve one case, people want more. And so it's another possible way of addressing the problem. Yeah.
Great. Thank you so much. Thank you. I promise you we will get back to that later. We're
We'll-
running a
we'll
bit
do
short
it.
of time. Yeah. Thank you
Thank
so
you.
much. And Bruce, you have a present too.